Looks like we're about ready to roll. Hi there, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and hopefully everything is working fine here. And I'm trying to decide whether or not to go with a world of strangeness. Like having a subtly freaky effect here with the psychedelicism of that stuff. But maybe not. Let me go back to my teal and orange one, if I can find it. My throat might be a little screwed today. Hopefully not. We'll see. And don't mind me while I fiddle with my camera and things. Hey, Ahmed. Oh, Phobos. Folks who are used to these, oh goodness, let me, there we go. Yeah, we got our classy darkness of the teal and orange thing. People will sometimes comment like, oh, it's so dark. Well, it's actually bright as hell in here, but I'm using the camera settings to make it look a certain way. Sometimes if you're going for like a lovely dark tone, the inside of the room actually has to be bright as anything, but you're using the camera to dial it back down. It's like doing a day for night in filmmaking. But yeah, so we might have some new visitors today, Ahmed. I usually have a small number of people who stop by the streams, and I use like my pen and paper, explain technical subjects, or we all like think of plugins that I don't necessarily do right away. But I have made a new discovery recently, and it might have an effect on this stream. Namely, there is a musician, Colin Benders, who I've quite liked his stuff, and he has been doing a modular streaming thing, which is really kind of blown up, but there is a group of people that latched onto this, going by the moniker Streampunks. And Colin started up a Discord server, much like I did the Airwindows Discord server, and it's ginormous and huge and full of the coolest pile of relentlessly techno and synth-oriented people I've ever seen in my life. It's the funnest thing ever. So what I was doing this morning was hanging out in that until the last possible moment. And I mentioned that I did streams and stuff too, and also mentioned that I was here and able to answer questions and things. So it's possible that folks from that community might be dropping by and asking me how some of this Airwindows stuff works. So bear that in mind. Now, I can't actually hear any of you because I don't have audio patched through here, though technically I could run the Discord, but we're not going to get into that today. But in the live chat for the stream, I should see everything, and I will do my level best to answer any questions. Yeah, totally. Not only new people, but new people who are very simpatico to what the Airwindows crew is like. It's like meeting of two amoebas that are basically the same thing in Glorp, and so we'll see how that works. It might happen, it might not, depends. But it is fun for me to encounter this crowd, this crew, and be like, look at all these people who are doing all of these. The homework Phobos is talking about is, I think, looking up what I just posted yesterday, which is like, don't worry about that. I think a lot of people in the Airwindows side of things, if they show, might not have dug into that very much. But sometimes it takes a little time to get into it. Oh, did I forget to put the chat window on the screen? Yeah, here's another thing is something that I like to do is I'm telling OBS to include the, and thank you for mentioning that because otherwise I wouldn't have known. I like including the chat window, and you know what, I can also make it be slightly bigger fonted, and fiddling with OBS in this way. And when I do that, I need to adjust the angle of the camera so that I can still be properly seen. And behind me, Phobos is what I perform on. It's a Pittsburgh modular 420 case that is literally full of stuff, and a bunch of it is control and sequencing. And the Airwindows folk don't always like me talking about that stuff because it's not freely downloadable. But I do my best, like the firmware is freely downloadable. And so now it is up on the screen because it also helps people keep track of what subjects I am currently being distracted and not answering. That is a criticism I have gotten many times, and I plead not being a very smart person or being a very distracted person or just having too many ideas. And so you kind of get what you get with that. I haven't been drinking coffee all morning, so it shouldn't be too overwhelming, I hope. So yeah, one of the things I was thinking about today, although I did not actually have I didn't write up a list of stuff that I could talk about. Sometimes I've had very good question and answer sessions because I came with sort of an instruction manual. Immediate question. This time I don't, but I had an idea for something that I could talk about, namely extraneous outside things. And when you're getting into doing creative stuff like this, what kinds of external things, what kinds of other domains do you also have to master in order to be able to do it? Because there's a lot of stuff like that. So Ben, in C5 raw console, if I remember correctly, that's a yeah, Purist console is the one that has no controls at all, and all of your gain staging has to be within previous plugins. You know, as far as in C5 raw console, I don't remember exactly what I had going on there. But in the console plugins, the channel plugins, if they have a gain control that's pre-effect by design, because there's no useful purpose to have output gain on that. And so by definition, anything in a gain control in a console channel plugin is going to scale the input signal to be in the sweet spot instead of clamping it. And there is no actual like the Ahmed, I have something that used that. I went through a period of trying to do all of my compressors over where it showed only the delta from the dry, and like 6 different compressors failed to work when I tried to make that happen, which was a bit of a drag, but you know, we do what we can. It's something that I did indeed try to do. I think of something like, it's like the clip only option in 80 clip, or what else was there? DS, DBES, the follow-up to DS has one like that. The DBES plugin contains not only, I think maybe DS does as well, it contains not only the control where you get more and more pulls of the de-essing behavior, but also an option where you can monitor only the S, and that lets you hear both what's being taken out of the regular signal, which could be almost nothing, or hear the raw S's that are literally being taken out. And again, I tried quite hard to put a bunch of delta signals into a series of compressors. There are many plugins in which that is not like Precious. Oh, I had a drive-by from my pet hater. This is fellow who often posts on my plugins, and it's like, this is garbage and sucks, and why do you like analog things? Because analog things stink, and this plugin just makes everything sound worse, and you suck, and your plugins suck. And he came around again on Precious. He was like, sorry, this is the worst one yet. And I'm like, okay, don't use it. There are many other plugins that I've made that you could use. So yeah, let's see. Isolating. Yeah, see, Ben, doing the encode decode thing with slew is what got Console 5 in trouble. Console 5 is the one where it released on Christmas. You know, this is a few years back, like my mom and dad were still alive. I was going out to visit my mom and dad in Pennsylvania back when they were around. And I hit the road, and in Pennsylvania realized that everything had gone horribly wrong and my plugin was failing gratuitously because the Console 5's slew processing being like trying to encode and then decode the slew as well as the amplitude factor on things. Given asymmetrical waveforms, like anybody from the Streampunks crew might recognize this, sawtooth waves, anyone? That broke Console 5 as it was released. And the thing about that is I had to fix it on the fly, and there was no good solution to it. There was no way of really dealing with it. So I haven't solved that one yet. Like, if I do, that'll be very exciting. I would love to have that going on. You know, Ahmed, as far as new console emulation, these are not new, they are old. The ones that have been coming out that I talk about being a reissue of the character plugins, character is what happened before bus colors. And bus colors like rolled them in to a single one that you could select and change the algorithm to some extent. Whereas character was a more direct algorithm, and it just basically what these do is, and I'll use my pen and paper and sketch this, is you'd have like two impulse responses, because somebody was making impulse responses of hardware gear and going, please, he's basically asking for Nebula before Nebula existed. I think before Nebula existed. He was going, please, somebody make a thing where I can have the, this is my API pre at minus 60 dB, and this is my API pre at plus 18, and oh, by the way, here is a whole range of impulse responses controlling this, the impulse response of this preamplifier between quiet and super loud. Please make me something that merges between these things so that I can have the impulse response that responds dynamically to quiet to loud. And of course that's Nebula, but at the time I also jumped into that. I don't think Nebula was using his responses, but they might actually have been. I know that there have been lots of those out there. And basically, character was take a really quiet one, take a large one, work out the mathematical, like the delta between these two, like what Ahmed was saying earlier, which is going to be like this plus this equals this. And then you start with this, and depending upon the amplitude of your input signal, you add a certain amount of whatever this one was. And if they were like strikingly different, maybe what you'd have is like some weirdness in here where to get the difference between these two, it starts to diverge. And you'd have more and more of this funniness brought in, and perhaps getting a an intermediate stage that's not like any actual sample that you could get. And that was character. And so when you ask why are they killing the lows, it's, well, two reasons. One of them is that it is not a FFT calculation, because I've not mastered those. If I ever did, I would be able to come up with some good ones, but I haven't got there yet. So it's basically a raw convolution algorithm that is a very narrow snippet of sound. It's not a long tail convolution algorithm. You couldn't make a reverb this way. But it's good at adding, it's basically like a FIR filter. All of these things are kind of the same thing where any given sound, you have a waveform, and so your waveform has individual samples at given moments. So if you get a sound, and your sound is like a big spike here, it's like a square wave, what you're going to do is start including however much of this amplified this much. Like if this is 0 to 1, then you're including a copy of this 1 times this, 1 times this. If it was the inverse, -1, it would be -1 times this. And if it was like -0.5, it'd be -0.5 times this. You're basically taking the input signal and scaling it by the also waveform in the impulse response you're using. And the reason it gets time consuming or CPU consuming is that you're also doing the previous samples. Like your initial sample, you're going to be having this one, and then the previous sample you're going to have this, and then the sample before that you're going to have this, and so on. And it's just your input waveform is going along, but you're also keeping track of a window of samples that is as wide as your whole impulse response and multiplying them all. So it gets real. This is why convolution reverbs are CPU hungry, is because the more of them you include, the more multiplications and things you got to do for every single sample of your audio. And the reason it would be killing the lows is because the particular convolution impulse that I included had some of that effect, but the character plugins let you multiply the amount by like 3. You get to multiply the intensity of that convolution, and that can lead to some weird effects. Like it's unnatural, the extent to which this magnifies the effect. And if there is any low frequency cut in the convolution, and you crank it way up and multiply it by 3, then you're going to get a massive low frequency cut out of there, or strange inversions and things. And the reason I'm putting them out is because that can be useful in its own right. It's not about, for a long time I have not been about trying to claim to steal other people's intellectual property by pretending that I have like their trade name, and it's like, oh, this is an SSL desk. Here, use my free SSL desk. I made you a SSL desk for free. Here, you can have this. I'm not down with that. It would be lies, but it's also kind of rude to the people that built the hardware. And so doctoring doctoring these things by making the option to turn up the character to 3 and produce something that no longer resembles anything in reality is right up my alley. Like, this is exactly what I would want to do. And so if there is a slight bass cut in many of these, which are hardware devices, and they were being measured by somebody with a converters that I do not know what they had, Like, these weren't my samples. These were somebody who was like, please somebody make something from these. But I can't like attest to the provenance of these initial samples. And then character itself was modified from the samples. The samples stopped being even a representation of what anybody actually had a long time ago. They're very cumbersome and hard to work with. They're basically just raw multiplications by, fixed float numbers, and basically if they're all killing base when you turn up the character and stuff, that's just because that's what that algorithm does. It's not that it was necessarily meant to. It's like that's what that set of samples and generating the sample on the fly based on combining the loud one and the quiet one, that's what that had. In fact, I think actually that one of the things that contributes to this is I mentioned how you start with like the quiet sample and the loud sample, and then you made the factor, which is the combination of the two. And in theory, when you're having stuff at full loudness, it will combine the quiet one, which is your baseline one, to the modification, making it the equivalent of the top level, the top volume one. And I don't think this would actually work for I don't think that would actually work for distorting very well. Hard to say, it's complicated. But my point being, if I do the character and multiply that to 3, what I'm doing is taking this basic one and then doing basically the delta and multiplying that by 3, and who knows what's going to happen. All I know is like, well, if that seems weird, then I want to give it a try, because I'm not out to exactly mimic something that was somebody else's thing. I want to create something that was more original. And that's the whole, that's the idea there. So, yeah, the base calculation might very well be a factor of that. So let me scroll back and see whether there's anything else. But ask questions, there's plenty of you here. And you can also ask questions about the lookup tables and things. That I can even demonstrate to some extent. And I know there's some folks that might be from the Streampunks community who might be curious about that, and it's more relevant to what they're doing. So you feel free to ask. Also, Ahmed, it is not a reverse slew. I don't have anything that's quite like slew for lows. But if you find that you can use that like that, then that's good. Very pleasing is always good. Joe, I'm happy that the Precious is using the tones for your acoustic guitar. Bus Colors Holo ought to do something similar to that, although it's not going to be exactly the same. So if you like that, that's a way to find something sort of parallel. Resi Q. I have put out Resi Q, haven't I? Isn't that one of the ones that is already out as a VST? You see, one of the problems with, I remember what I was doing in Resi Q, so I can talk about that to some extent. Yeah, lookup table is. Resi Q is from back in around 2007 or so. And what it is it's another convolution impulse. Oh, wait, like my new cup? I got a cup. It's not necessarily better than my previous cup, but it is fine. Resi Q works like this. Where'd my pen go? Here it is. There you were. So I was talking about convolution impulses. And like I said, you can draw an arbitrary thing, and that is your convolution impulse, and it's like a little noise or a little tone thing. Resi Q is using essentially sines. And it's using sine wave shapes to generate on the fly a convolution impulse that it then applies. And back in 2007, that was really CPU munching. I mean, it already is, because I'm not doing it with FFT calculations. I'm doing it like with raw. It's like a really complicated delay where there are like 500 delay taps. It's basically like that, which is what a convolution impulse is it's like 500 delay taps all at different volumes. And they're attenuverters, so they can be inverse. But the way I dealt with resizing or repitching the things in ResiQ, and I don't know whether I ever put out Scalpel as VST, but Scalpel is the same thing as ResiQ, but it's one band. And then ResiQ is like however many, six bands, no dry, just reconstruct. I'm sure I put it out as VST. Reconstruct your sound using only really narrow bandpass filters. It's kind of like the, for those of you from the Streampucks community, it's kind of like the Moog fixed frequency bank, but possibly narrower. In fact, probably is narrower. And it would also serve as a respectable vocoder, but the idea is you can sort of dial the individual things around. The whole idea with ResiQ is that giving these very resonant, like building a convolution impulse out of multiple sine wave things. And there is a quirk on the beginning where the attack of it is like twice as fast and then it switches to sine wave, because I identified in a impulse response from I think a Moog synthesizer that analog stuff didn't simply do like strictly a waveform from the beginning point and then onwards. Instead, the onset was different. The onset was like a little faster, and I identified it as being maybe twice, whatever it was I did, that's what's in ResiQ. And that contributes to it having this very analog-y resonant feel. But ResiQ is about stacking up a whole bunch of these until it's an unusual convolution impulse that is intensely, intensely resonant. And then you're supposed to be able to reconstruct a sound by doing this essentially like the Moog fixed frequency bank. You're reconstructing the sound out of individual filters. And one of the things that does is that kills everything that's not in the filters you choose. And the reason ResiQ lets you move the pitches, I'm getting on to where it warbles a little bit when you move it. The reason that it lets you move the filters is because you can often reconstruct a sound fairly accurately by using a range of these different filters and dialing them in properly. You can get a good tone, and one of the characteristics of like good mimic tones done with ResiQ is that stuff sits in a mix and does not interfere with other things. Other things come right past it. It does not fill up space. It's the opposite of like bit crushing. Bit crushing fills up space, makes stuff be very opaque. And ResiQ doing things with intense resonances. I will also point out in my pet like holy war against Soothe. I don't really dislike the people behind Soothe, but it's become a bit of a joke now, like I'm the Soothe hater. ResiQ is the anti-Soothe. It is constructing things only around tight resonances. And when you do that, the sounds that you have in the mix carry the relevant things you're doing with them, like whatever mid-range you have cutting through, the lower mids, anything that you've built out of the resonant peaks in ResiQ will come through at whatever amplitude you need for it to be heard. But then other things in the mix don't get covered up by it at all. The stuff that you make with ResiQ is unusually transparent in terms of obscuring other things in the mix, whereas stuff that you put in with bit crushing is unusually opaque, unusually capable of obscuring other things in the mix. Because rather than having narrowly isolated resonant peaks, bit crushing, and especially frequency crushing, but certainly bit crushing, throws up inharmonic partials all across the frequency spectrum. So any sound that you bit crush, any sound that you make like lo-fi, and sometimes lo-fi just means it's also band limited, so bit crush doesn't always mean super bright, abrasive, high frequency sounds. It can be a little darker, but it's still throwing inharmonic artifacts in there a lot. And that makes stuff more opaque. It makes like beats and things that you bit crush will take up more space and will lose some of their defining characteristic. Your ear can't tune into them that well because the digital bit crush sounds are inharmonic and somewhat distracting, and they're not the same instant by instant. So you get a sort of blur of extraneous noise. And yeah. So as promised, here is why ResiQ does what it does. I made it in 2007, and we didn't have CPU back then. You know, we're barely out of the 486 days, right? And to change what is already a convolution plugin so that it has new waveform, I had to do a new waveform for any slight change that might happen. And I knew to cache it so that you weren't just generating the impulse every single time. That would be really costly. But to change one of those resonant peaks would involve recalculating the entire thing based on like 6 different sine generation things for the entire length of the impulse that I was making. And if I tried to do the entire thing in a single sample, then the computer might choke and fall over. So with ResiQ, what it does is it recalculates one thing in the impulse when you have a new setting. It flags it and says like, okay, start recalculating everything. And then it will start going through and doing like one of the samples, so that impulse response is churning for a little while. Like you said, a few seconds, it'll go. And in so doing, it's not settling down right away, but it's also not recalculating the entire impulse for all of the different frequencies in a single go. Because that runs the risk of like breaking your stream or hitting the computer so hard that the buffer falls over and you get a buffer interrupt and your recording or your mixing like breaks and falls off. So that was the 2007 grade CPU. Modern computers, especially handling it properly, are capable maybe of generating, like, sine functions are fairly expensive too, and it's a challenge. It's definitely a thing as far as figuring out what can be done there. So I'm making a little note to myself, ResiQ, maybe looking back into that. I have a stack of papers of things that I need to look into, so it can be in there. But what you do is you design it so that it's only recalculating one thing in that impulse per sample, and that way the computer doesn't fall over when you've changed a thing, but that's what causes that effect. The subtle down effect is being caused by that. I do have an idea for an alternate form of tape delay, and I feel like some other people must have either figured this out long before me, or I don't know, something. But being able to do delay effects where if you twiddle them, the pitch wavers like it does in analog gear, is something that I've always kind of wanted. I just have not, I have not struck on what people are clearly doing to make that happen. It might be a cheat. They might be like, oh, if you do this, then patch everything through this pitch shifter and stuff. And I never like it when that kind of thing is done. Instead, what I'd like to do is come up with the algorithm where it's legitimately doing what it's supposed to. And probably what that's going to involve is making a delay where I am constantly running a much higher internal sample rate, and anything that you're doing regarding the pitch shift or whatever is going to basically count like, okay, so is one sample in the playback going to cover 18 samples of the internal like tape or recording, or is it going to cover 275 samples of the internal tape and recording? And if so, how do you manage that? And it's fairly easy to capture the sample back out. You just grab whatever is at the correct moment, or indeed average a couple of them together. But how do you record to that? And basically what that means is, and it wouldn't have to be accurate as long as it did the right thing, you could just linear interpolate between the sample that you're at and then the next sample. Is you would just do a interpolation between where you were and, you know, a previous sample and the one where you're at now. And if you do that, then you could slow it right down or speed it up or whatever, and you'd be getting a correct value there. It would also work for things like chorus and flange effects as well. And I have not yet tried that one, and I don't know whether it is just trivial common practice. I've never seen anybody doing it. Or whether it's something where it's one of those Chris things, which is like, well, why would you do that when you can just fake the pitch modification? And you know, so that's worth trying as well. I will give that a shot at some point. I think I might have a note on that one, but I can also just write that down here too. Just making some crude notes here so that I hopefully remember what the hell it was I was thinking about, because that's the problem. You start free associating around this kind of stuff and answering all the questions, and then you just go through whatever. Yeah, one of my challenges with Q&A, Joku, is that, or Jokus, I'm not exactly, I tend to see that name as Joku Sekofan, but I can read the whole thing out. Joku Sekofan. OBS doesn't handle all my plugins well. Right now, the deal with OBS is that I can open a bunch of plugins in, but it will not load anything as far as interface is concerned. And I'm not sure that it loads other people's, VST plugins either. But it certainly, it can load mine as long as they have no interface, which some of them have no interface. Or if you like what the default thing does, which is also sometimes a possibility. So I can't actually do that while doing my stream here. And I know, right? There are some things that could be done that way. Let me scroll up again a little bit, see what we got going on. We're going to be going until like 12:43 or so, because things have been going pretty well with the Patreon stuff. I was telling some of the folks in the Colin Bender's Discord about that. There are goals I have going on as far as DIYing and stuff that are interesting. I could probably get ResEQ to run faster because we can burn more CPU these days. Doesn't have to be literally every time, but the slowness of how it settles down is definitely adjustable. Like it does, all that's happening basically, if it's being slow, it's not whacking your CPU as hard as it might. I could make it be instant, at which point it would just clobber your CPU anytime you adjusted it. All of a sudden it'd be like, crunch, I have 12 convolution reverbs running, and then they're gone. So that is a thing there. Yeah, Truth Trader is likened to Tape 5. Good, thank you. I'm glad that you like that. Would it make sense for the dry wet and average to be an inverse dry wet? You know? That would indeed make sense. I could see that happening. And you know, I'd been thinking about revisiting average in such a way that not only could you have a broader window, because with average you're literally just scaling up a window. Like every new sample that you add, it's sneaking the level of it up a little bit and it's becoming part of the block, and it's a rectangular sample function. This causes what some of the other plugins produce, which is those funny artifacts and comb filtery things. But that's also why it sounds nice. But what average doesn't have, as far as I know, is, if I remember correctly, I'm just asking again a thing about a band that I don't know. Average can have multiple poles as well. In fact, that's what I'm doing with a recent plugin that escapes me at the moment. What the hell was that? Oh yeah, it was, if not distortion, then something much like it. You know what? I'm actually going to go and take a moment and look at my stuff, because I know it was fairly recent. So I do a lot of work, so sometimes stuff gets lost or it starts confusing me about things. Yeah, I think it was distortion. So I don't need to leave that open. When we're talking about average, what distortion specifically does, in order to make it be the slightly dark distortion that continues to be slightly dark no matter what sample rate you're running, it has a consistent slight darkness to it. And the side effect is that running at high sample rates, my recent distortion plugin is unusually good at avoiding aliasing without running oversampling. It has a completely different behavior, a completely different effect than oversampling, which increases linearity of word length rather than reduces it, which oversampling tends to lose that because it's trying so hard to be a perfect passband. And the thing about how I did that is I did that with multiple levels of simple averaging. It's 2-sample averaging at multiple poles. So if you're like at 192K, it's running like 9 poles of averaging. And what poles means, in the synthesizer guys can recognize this as part of their filters. What poles means is you're running the same filter over and over again to steepen and exaggerate it. So the thing about that is I don't think my average plugin does that yet. I think the average plugin, which does not have inverse dry wet yet, also does not have an additional parameter of how many poles you're using, which would be an integer number, I believe. Although I did come up with that way of making integer factors more linear. Basically, the way you do that is some other plugin back in the day. I had this going on, possibly Crunchy Grooveware and Grooveware. But the way to do that is you have your fixed stage where you can only do like 2 or 3 or 4 of this. So every single time you're generating something and it wants to be 2.5, what you do is 2 and then crossfade half the way to the 3. So it's half 2 and half 3. That becomes 2.5. And that's how you make something where you can only have integer numbers of a process, and yet you want to have fractional numbers of that process. So that would also be something to include in the average. My way of dealing with the same problem in DRES is completely different. So I just wrote fractional poles. Hopefully I remember what that meant. And let me scan my question things as well. We got about an hour to go, so. Ben says, clobber the CPU, please, because maybe you can have it so once it's settled, yeah, scalable. So, yep, we'll see about that. Note that I have a backlog already, and there's like 2 definite solid plugin suggestions just today alone. So remember, we talk about these things. That doesn't mean you're going to see them next week. We'll see what we get. So OBS, yeah, Vinyl I think is absolutely correct that VSTs that are generic interface don't do anything properly. It would be really nice if they did that. A lot of DAWs do, and it's not, well, I can't say it's not all that hard because I couldn't do it for them. I'm not a host programmer. I can't make plugins that host things because this is on a whole other area. It's like expecting a musician to be good at instrument building, and granted, the modular synth folks are kind of laughing about that because the whole thing is like I'm building the instrument and also performing on it, and the building of it is also the performance of it. But it's more like asking somebody to extrude aluminum faceplates and stuff. It's like, I don't know how to do that and I don't have the facilities. That is like that with me programming host plugins that can host other plugins or draw their own interfaces and stuff. I'm not there. So the thing about your question, Ahmed, here, is I have no idea what these kick and tom sounds without using reverb, although I will say phase nudge. Phase nudge will washy stuff up because phase nudge is like an all-pass filter, and you could use multiple stacks of that. So put a bunch of phase nudge and see whether that gets you anywhere. It's not really reverb, but it is a all-pass filter nonetheless, and that might work. Or settings in MV. MV is designed to do stuff like that. What you'd be doing is using a very tight and quick MV. A plugin to adjust the volume. Yeah, so you're talking about a level matching plugin. That is not really a good thing to ask me for a couple of reasons. One of them is I don't actually buy that concept, but also that involves the plugins either talking to each other through the DAW somehow, or being able to interpret what another plugin is doing. And all of mine are kind of standalone, so I am not down with the level matching concept, as people treat that as absolutely vital, and I resist that concept. But also I don't have the facility to interpret what another plugin is doing, so I can't actually do that one. Oh, indeed. Dave Robertson, who is actually on my masthead at Airwindows, if I remember correctly, over in presumably Gear Sluts. And a tap value of, so 2 averages in sequence? Yeah, because I mean, that's what distortion is, using multiple poles of just a simple 2-point average to make the higher sample rate stuff be slightly rolled off, same as the lower sample rate stuff. And it's just stacking them up. And so that does seem like a legitimate suggestion and worth doing. You know, I couldn't really tell you what Coldplay sounds like either. Go figure. Sorry about that. And something to do with LoudMax. So yeah, I think I've caught up with the questions so far to the extent that I can. One of the things I was going to talk about today was the level of additional things that are required for creating and stuff, like coffee making. Well, no, I'm kidding. Not coffee making. Cheese making. Hi, Johan Joseph, I do like cheese some of the time. Why? Do you have some for me? Are we going to do something disruptive that forces me to switch away from live chat to top chat? I guess we'll find out, won't we? So the challenge with some of this stuff is that in order to be a individual making creative things on YouTube or Twitch or whatever, you wind up having to be master of a bunch of different domains. And that is why it's useful to know people who do stuff. It's why it's useful to have open source stuff. And you need to... That's not a cheese. Re is not a cheese. We know perfectly well that re is not a cheese. Come on. So basically, oh, Chris, can you do those video filters now? Yes, I can. That is something that I can do. So we will put chat through the video filters. Haha. Guess what, chat? You're going to go weird instead of me. So there. Re, you say, Johan? There's your re for you. Actually, that's not all that extreme. Let's find out what we can make happen. 2. Okay, none of these are all that good. How about the DOS boat LUT? There you go, chat. How'd you like that? I can do the video filters, you see? We'll do the video... In fact, I'll do the video filters on me just for a moment because we got about an hour or so to go, so there's time to play a little bit. We can be together in DOS boat. There we are. So there's your answer to, can you do those video filters now? Are we enjoying them? Is that something that is good? That's enough fun for now. So there is no reason to have apply LUT on that. And yeah, this is one that I did with that video that I just posted on how to make LUTs. This is one using that technique. And we'll go and put it back now because might as well. Actually, that isn't even the full Monty. This is the full LUT. It's even darker and even more neon. But back we go to relative normalcy. So yeah, that is one of the things that I've done fairly recently. And it's been a few weeks of grinding away on that while simultaneously doing plugins and other things and my music jams and all that. If it was focused correctly, you could see that I've been wiring up new wires for the synthesizer back there. Maybe I'll zoom it in so that when I do another music stream, you can see a little more clearly. but my control system in there is running on basically individual little wires. I need to get lots more of that wire because I want to distribute it to people as well. So there's about 50 minutes of video on how to do those video filters. And I have made a downloadable pack of what I'm calling Psych, which is the first level of those. Works good on images and stuff. And there's a wide range of other things that I could do, because that acts kind of like the video equivalent of Airwindows plugins. It's very simple and functional. And what you do is just manipulate images in such a way that it's making the crazy effect that you want within certain, like you can't do lens effect filters. You can't do anything that is going to move a pixel in XY dimensions. But anything that you do with regard to color ranges can be translated into video, as you just saw. So what you do is you go into some program, something that works well for you that way. Like I am a fan of Affinity Photo in terms of that kind of stuff, because the color correction stuff that it has feels like it's really good. Anybody that is a Photoshop user and is paying Adobe to have access to all that kind of stuff, that's clearly what you would want to use. It's basically the same. Not necessarily better, mind you, but it is basically the same as what Affinity Photo does for me there. Actually, come to think of it, let me take a moment, and I wonder whether, oh no, we're good. I was trying to see what my clocking was, whether my whole system was being clocked to this camera, which isn't actually giving me audio. Which brings me to that topic of needing to master all these different domains. Because anytime you're trying to do something that's like YouTubing or whatever, you wind up discovering that there's depths upon depths of any little detail that you get into. Like, would you know, for instance, that the actual brightness of my room is kind of like this. This is kind of how bright things are in here right now. To back away from the ring light that's blinding me. This is kind of what the room really looks like. All right, this is video maker stuff here, and the deal with that is you wouldn't know that looking at the person's YouTube output. You wouldn't know that their room basically just looks like this, and it's really bright and glaring, and you got a bunch of lights all over the place, like there's a light over there and then there's a light back there, because they're using their camera settings to produce a desired effect that might be quite different. And the thing about using the overly bright lights and then using the camera to cool it off is that you get to use lower ISO numbers, meaning that you have less noise in the darks. And that helps you compress things. Like you can see that the darks are all just very buried here. And it's a kind of relaxed, chill feeling, like a quiet, dark afternoon over in the Airwindows cave. It's completely fake. As you just saw, it's completely fake. And the specific video thing, the lookup tables, that's changing stuff as well. You're constructing this fictional thing. And that's kind of the idea. And it goes for stuff like the lookup tables. It goes for a variety of musical and audio things. The video people are having the same problem with audio, like they don't know how to use microphones. I saw one where a couple of guys seemed to be using the same condenser microphone, and one of them was side address and one of them was talking into the end of it, and I really can't tell whether they're really the same mic or whether they were just crazy and didn't know how to use it, but their general audio was terrible, and they would be bumping their table with huge thumps coming through the audio all the time, because they were professional VFX artists working in, not Blender, but the professional versions of those things. Since I have so little experience with that, I don't know even the names of the programs. That they were working in the $10,000 programs, and their whole stream and stuff was based on telling people what to think about that. So they didn't have the audio stuff down. They didn't know it. And there is so much to keep track of, and there's just life lesson things as far as like managing your budget so you don't go broke, staying healthy, all manner of stuff. There's just a lot to everything. Now, before I go any farther, I need to speak to Vinyl, who keeps asking stuff, and I swear that, see, focus is the isolate a mid-range band, separate it from the audio, and then distort just that mid-range band. In theory, you could use it for compression. I'll make a little note of that, seeing as it took you apparently a long time to get my attention with this one. This is one of the problems, is like, I'm talking from the inside of my own head. I can see what you say. Maybe I just registered it, or maybe I didn't understand what you asked, or a variety of things like that. But let me give it a different page, because this is starting to stack up. Because the great thing about stuff like that is sometimes I can rebuild them out of individual plugins. Like I could take the guts of Focus and go like, okay, let's throw a compression algorithm and replace this part of it, but this other part of it, I get to literally keep from the previous plugin because it's exactly what I needed. So that's promising, because that's something that could actually happen without me having to work too many weeks on it. Hope that helps, Vinyl, and I hope that's something that I can get to make happen. Because the thing about compression is, if you have very quick compression, that does relate to things like distortion and aliasing. The faster your compressor responds, the more aliasing you're going to get. And this happens in a lesser extent even in analog. The faster it responds, the more distortion it'll produce. So using the focus concept to restrict its ability to throw high frequency aliasing noises could be useful. And the fact that it's focus is a distortion, you could use some kind of compression in that way, and it would act a little bit like a multi-band compressor or whatever, and that it would be compressing only that mid-range region, which would have a similar effect. Honestly, it's going to sound a lot like the density setting of Focus. That's the softest, or indeed Spiral, but mostly the density setting of Focus, because that is the softest distortion curve. So if you're compressing, the deal there is it's going to make maybe it could be combined with things like curve or recurve. It might be a possible thing of it. What's going to happen is you're going to have a level dependent focus. That's going to make a thing where quieter sounds get more of the focus effect on them, and then louder sounds go back to the original behavior again. So if that's what you wanted, maybe that's something that can happen. If that's not what you wanted, I don't know how I can help you. I'm scrolling back a little bit because I'm going to see what people were saying. DSEQ, blah, 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 resonance things, yes. Loudness penalty website. I have a different approach to loudness penalty stuff myself. But, I should make a note of Hilbert transform, because now I'm curious. Maybe I'll be able to make some sense of that. Because essentially what I need to look for is different ways, different basic concepts of doing stuff like this that I can incorporate in sort of Airwindows eyes. You know that with FFT processing, they're doing millions and billions of calculations, but probably all of their audio signals are being kept as floats. And that means the quality of it is going to start eroding pretty fast. And we know better than that. So there are times when you can take what people are doing and then start doing different things, like, okay, FFT, but everything is long doubles. Just cause. How does this sound any different? And seeing what are FFT and there's much fewer bins or much more bins, stuff like that. I'm not there yet, but that's the sort of thing that I would start doing with this stuff. And by the way, I would note that people sometimes jump on these things and start doing them when they're not me, but they heard me talk about stuff, or they have access to the open source, and there is somebody who is starting to do VCV rack plugins that are Airwindows. He's got MV and I think a couple of other ones besides, and is asking about how to properly do console and if he successfully did console as a VCV rack plugin, I would start using it. I'm not entirely sure if that's correct, but there's the thing, is people can start doing stuff, and I don't even necessarily have to know about it, so long as they're honoring the MIT license, which is very, very permissive. Yep, so Hilbert, I'll look into that, see what it does. How hackable is OBS for someone like me? Well, my trouble is that I have very domain-specific knowledge. Like, I try stuff having to do with audio processing. I try stuff having to do with piles of samples and things like that, and making interesting things happen when you have access to a bunch of samples and an input buffer, and you have to fill up an output buffer with something like them. And that's similar to what I'm doing with the lookup tables. The lookup tables are also me being like, I have input colors and I need to put output colors. And what can we do to change between those two things? So that doesn't mean I know how to go into the code of OBS and figure out where it makes these little menus and stuff. If I knew how to do that, I would be setting it up so that you could script the lookup tables and maybe crossfade between them, or at least if you couldn't crossfade between them, then switching between them would be acceptable. On a time basis, or by hitting buttons or having some kind of continuous controller. But the time basis would be best, because I would just tell it, like, okay, an hour in, do this thing. And then I'd be able to do a bunch of really creative stuff that way. But I don't have the ability to do that, because I don't know how to program these applications. That said, I'm very interested in game engines, and I've made a game, Counterpart, in Unity. Counterpart is the game that is the most one of the most unstreamable games ever. There are ones that are even worse, that are almost like more of a joke. But Counterpart is supposed to look cool, and yet it's unstreamable, because it's using persistence of vision to average a wireframe effect being done in OpenGL. And turns out, when you have a lot of fine detail like that, which isn't even anti-alias necessarily, and then every frame you're jittering back and forth between two different images that are almost the same but not quite, it kills frame rate and makes everything look completely horrible. So, and I've worked some in Godot, and Godot engine is interesting because that's another open source one, and that's free. And counterpart was in Unity. I've gotten Unity again, and I'm going to see whether I can do anything interesting that way. And I've tried installing Unreal Engine and didn't really get anywhere with it. Lorenzo has a question that's about to scroll off the top of the screen. To tape 5, and it delivered the fattest and low end that I ever heard. What wizardry is behind this? It's a particular algorithm that is also in my 2tape. Well, it's in 2tape, but it's also in Fathom 5 and BaseKit. And it is a series of, well, it's a very simple algorithm. It's not even a series of algorithms. It's just that if you don't do it properly, it causes problems. Let's see, where's my paper? Like, if you have a waveform and you set the thing up so it's like, okay, we're going to slowly track what this waveform does. You can see this other line that's slowly following that. And what it's doing is, like, if this waveform is bigger, it tries to go this direction, and it sort of chases it. And that's something that you can do. And then you have a thing where it's like, we need to stop this from, it needs to return to 0 when it's done, right? Otherwise, it'll just be a DC offset. It'll be sitting around like there. So what you do is you go like, okay, you get pushed back by how far up you are. So if you are up here, you get pushed back this hard. And then if you're only here, you're barely, the amount of being pushed back you get is like a factor of how far from 0 you are multiplied by itself several times. So you start getting in this thing where if it gets too far up and it's going to distort, it just gets distorted right back. And it's a very powerful distort that way. But down near the center, there's almost no effect at all. So you wind up getting these big fat bass sounds that waver around near the center of the audio output. And if they push too hard, they tend to soft clip. But if they are not that loud, they don't clip nearly as hard. And in fact, they can sort of lean in one direction or another with almost nothing being done to them. And then what you need to do is apply some filtering afterwards, because otherwise it will produce DC offset. It'll just sort of sit at a DC voltage for a while. And that algorithm is what causes to tape to sound the way that it does. It is a combination of a filter and a distortion and a nonlinear saturation kind of thing. So basically that's the way that 2tape and Fathom 5 and BaseKit, all that sub-bass stuff, does its thing by using that algorithm. Let me scroll back and see what else, because people are rushing ahead, which is good. It's good, keeps things happening. Oh, hey, Nojo is in chat. Cool. VCO console does something. Yeah, the calibration thing. Yep. Nojo should be using Purist console to start off with. Anything else might get you in trouble. Fuckwan Moore, you need to look through my library. You seriously need to look through my library. There is like 200 plugins. So don't assume I haven't already done the one you need. I may very well have already done the one you need. It might be right there. Rather than getting, if that's where you're at, rather than getting a starter kit, you should download new updates.zip and start digging through there and finding what it is that you need, because there's a lot out already. And many of them are super appropriate to hip-hop design stuff, so as you know. Yeah, I try to drop a plugin every week, Cosmic, so I don't like to divert from that, particularly since the backlog is so big, so I try to build up piles of things that need to come out at some point. And sometimes it's like re-releases, and sometimes it's new stuff. And it's generally going like once a week is I've got a new plugin coming out. That also means that I can talk about things like the lookup tables and sneak them in as just one more thing, because there's no such thing as like a gear slots for lookup tables. That doesn't exist. So you wind up with only the exposure that you can get, and if you're doing something that maybe people would really like but there's no place to get to them, then nobody will ever hear. Because the other side of that stuff I talked about with having to be the master of many domains is you also have to be the master of marketing and business running and sales and stuff like that. And, that's the last thing I can do. So the challenge there is being able to incorporate all the things you need in order to be visibly doing the one thing that you're recognized for doing. There is a pile of additional work behind all of those things. Yeah. Bow 2-tape can indeed produce, it has the same algorithm I told you about. So it produces bass emphasis. That's the head bump stuff. Head bump is literally the algorithm I just showed you. Yep. Ahmed, I have not yet made an amp plugin that I am satisfied with. That said, I think it's primarily you that is responsible for the fact that I'm going to start coming out with the older ones that I did were failures. So that's a challenge. That means I have to start putting out stuff that I don't like and that I would never use, because there are alternative uses to that stuff. But yeah, I'm not prepared to call these old ones amp plugins, and yet I kind of got to put them out because I have them back in the day, and they're like re-releases. I'd like to release like literally the entire library of everything that I've ever done eventually. So I got to fit them in somehow. Dishon, you got to ask the question right away and hope that I answer it. I'll do my best. So yeah, I'm not sure how far back the library goes. I know that things like Big Amp, Fire Amp, stuff like that, I was deeply dissatisfied with what they actually meant and what they actually did. I use tube amps and things. And I'm very fond of my funky, I'd like to DIY more as far as amps and guitar pedals and stuff too, because that could be great fun. And, well, Ahmed, quickly, I need to put my entire library out. There's going to be a time when, like, I'm over 50 in a time of coronavirus, and I stay home and I take care of myself, but there's going to be a time when I'm not with you guys anymore. So at that time, I'm going to want everything that I did to come out as open source and be on my GitHub and whatever. So these need to come out. Oh, Deshaun doesn't have a real question. You were a silly man. Join them. Part 2 of guitar conditioner, but more distorted, like guitar more conditioned. Any amp type thing that I do is probably going to be like, it's going to include some of those things. And my problem with the guitar things, and it's not necessarily as big a problem as I feel, but the problem with the guitar things is you run straight into the aliasing issues, and yet guitars sound good when they're really bright. So the least you'd want to do is run at a high sample rate, but I feel like in many ways it's just not possible to really get a guitar sound in the box to work the same way that a really good guitar and amp combination would do. I wonder if I can make this silliness going. Yeah, tell you what. We'll leave. We don't need your puddle of juice, but I will leave your fuck you. We'll see how much you need to do. I can go to Top Chat if it comes to a problem. I generally have a very nice crowd, but it all varies. So yeah, as far as you're getting unusually spammy, you need to take a breath. You can probably say things and still get through, but you're gonna have to be more clever about it. You might as well work a little harder to do this. So just guitar conditioner is not really a distortion unit, but it is a slew controller and a filter, and that kind of stuff. I can incorporate those things into guitar processing. The problem I run into is just, oh, by the way, Voxengo had just put out an amp. Voxengo put out a tube amp. So you should check that out, because I'm generally favorably impressed with what Voxengo does. Joku, there you are. Deshaun is going to try really hard to be disruptive. Okay, let's see what you can do. I mean, I could make the window go away or any of that go away anytime I want, but let's see whether you're annoying or more fun. Joku talking about the Chebyshev filter just to make ripples in the low range. See, that's not necessarily going to make things more analog, just kind of different. One thing I've learned from one of my trolls, which is the YouTube troll that like hates plugins, because he hates anything that's analog. He goes on about that stuff endlessly, and it's like an infinite appetite for saying, oh, this sucks because it makes things sound more horrible. He's got a bit of a point. It's not entirely right. I don't agree with all of that, but the thing about what that guy has to say, he was comparing like my work with the plugins with the starter kit reference mix, which was with some fairly expensive hardware, like Heritage Audio Mixer and Bus Compressor. And to get that, it's not necessarily that easy to get that together. So I did the mix with that. It's got a lot of transformers inside it. I'm very pleased with like the glue factor, all of that kind of stuff. I do make plugins for hip hop. I will make plugins and I will tech support you, Deshaun. I don't care if you got frisky. I get stream users like getting drunk or high and causing problems in my streams quite often. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You're fine. I generally ask people not to keep doing it, but when people are drunk or high, sometimes they have a hard time riding it out. Anyways, regarding this guy who hates my plugins or hates analog things, the interesting thing about that is he was like, your plugin mix is way better than the analog one because it's less smeary and less sort of band limited and such. And in a sense, he wasn't wrong. It's like, he was working on this basis of everything must be clear and pristine. And Deshaun, you're not blocked. We can still see you. I haven't hid the chat yet. You're being a little spammy, but you're not blocked. I just put it to top chat. That means that YouTube recognizes if you're swearing or whatever. And other people aren't likely to be too inhibited by that because they can talk about plugins all they want. But the using of this digital form of motivation for mixes and stuff, I listened back to some of the things and I was like, yeah, man, he has kind of a point. Like, if I was trying to get a particular effect, it's not a given that I would go with the expensive analog board. One thing I can tell you about the expensive analog board is it's fast to work with. Stuff just comes together. Like the glue effect or whatever, and knowing what you're doing means that stuff just kind of falls together very quickly. And that isn't necessarily the case with plugins, which is why I often recommend plugins that have no controls, or because you got to stop fiddling. Deshaun is getting cleverer and cleverer. You know, we'll see how this works out. I'm somewhat curious to see how clever Deshaun is as far as being a troll here, because a good, hard-working, dedicated person can still cause all kinds of massive disruption, even when restricted to using, good English and no swears and stuff. So we'll see. Be careful, though, because some words like hate or crazy might get you in trouble, too, with YouTube's algorithms. Now, so if I was doing a mix, I wouldn't automatically be wanting to apply exactly the filters and things, the smearing of the analog stuff that produces. That doesn't necessarily mean that I wouldn't want it, but being able to use a plugin setup in the box and get some of the effects out of that, as well as having some of it have more clarity and directness, there's something to be said for that. Like before I had the current mixing board, I had a couple of different ones. And some of the ones that I had were, I am going to mute that one. There we go. Yeah, come on. Just okay, we'll stick with that one. But yeah, my chat has some expectations. My chat and my crew tend to be on the nice millennial side and stuff. So there's certain kinds of carrying on that they won't be liking. And I speak for them in terms of that. They're not going to be down for that. Many of them are also vegans and stuff, so maybe you're going to start talking about beef. But as far as doing these mixes, if you're doing stuff, you don't automatically need to use analog gear. What you're looking for is particular types of conditioning to the sound that gets away from a particular effect. And the guy that is complaining about a bunch of my plugins, from a professional standpoint of someone who has a reputation and works in the field and doesn't just talk about racism or things on streams, like Deshaun, who's trying very hard to still be annoying. That guy has more to offer as far as a working professional is concerned, but he has these really strong antipathy to analog gear. I don't necessarily share that, but it's interesting to note that you can get he has something of a point is what I'm saying there. So yeah, it's getting on towards 12:30, so we got about 15 minutes or so to go. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. I'm not actually sure what mat is. People are talking about an EQ. Shivangadu. Yeah. By the way, somebody actually had me read a funny name at one point out loud. They showed up with a name and said, "Oh, hi." And I was like, "Oh, hi, fuck me loudly." And it was like, you got me. Because they did. They got me. So people are talking about an EQ from that or whatever. As far as the weird fuzzy distortion on the bass using 2-tape on my speakers, you probably either you don't hear it in your headphones because the headphones don't extend as low, or you got it turned up too much or something. Hard to say. You should be hearing stuff more easily in your headphones, most likely. Yeah. Phobos, as far as attitude, it's like I live on the internet like everybody else, so you get very different kinds of things going on. And sometimes it's stuff like this. Indeed, it's like the more people you get together, the more stuff is going to happen, and it, power reveals, and absolute power reveals absolutely. And that's somebody made a movie based on the life of Lyndon Johnson, and that was the conclusion he drew. So as far as attitude is concerned, I'd like to think of it more as like you stick around long enough in the streams and you see who Christopher from Airwindows really is. Ahmed, hard to say. It's all in the range there. Joku EQs and compressors are meant to be played with. It depends upon the kind. Like biquads don't take well to automating. They don't take well to changing them while they're running. There's kinds of EQs that you can have in the digital domain that freak out if you suddenly move the controls. Someone asked me to do a version of monitoring for small speakers. Huh? Monitoring should work for all kinds of speakers in all ways. Like, if you can't hear what the bass is doing, you should be able to turn on subs only, and at least you'll see it on the meters, but you should also hear it a little bit more clearly because it's exaggerated. That makes it be for small speakers. So monitoring is already for small speakers, as near as I can tell. Cosmic with tape fat. Tape fat is really old, man. Don't assume that that's necessarily what you want. It's just another, it's like, if I'm not mistaken, tape fat is the same algorithm as in iron oxide. So that's legit, but it might not be getting what you intend. Just because it's named tape fat doesn't mean that that's necessarily what you want. Don't you tell my users to shut up when I'm not making you shut up. I'll move your delete. There you go. So if people are going to fuss around in here, that's fine, or as fine as you can really expect on the internet. But don't you go after my users. I spank you if you go after my users. They will sass back at you. You don't tell them to shut up. Joku, I would say not most of my plugins are sample rate dependent, but some of them absolutely are. And a fair number of them are not identical on different levels. So basically you want to get used to what sample rate you're working at and have that be your general thing. I don't see a lot of use in flipping around between different sample rates within a project. It just does not seem useful to me. And some of the earlier ones are distinctly different at different sample rates, like the character plugins. But that doesn't mean that they mostly are, just that there are ones that very distinctly are. Yeah. Shriven Gadu, that's a mystery to me as well. Check it out through monitoring. Again, monitoring, the thing about monitoring is you can set whatever sound it is to subs only. Maybe that'll tell you more about what it's doing between whatever you're getting and not, because throw on monitoring and it should give you more of an idea. Maybe what's happening is you're putting more really clean bass than you think. That's one possibility. One possibility is that when it's not working for you and the regular ones are, it's because you're generating such low bass that your headphones are not distorting, but you're not hearing them. Whereas on the speakers, you might not be hearing it, but it's going to distort the woofer more. It's going to put things out of sorts. So what you might be needing there is to high pass the bass or restrict it in some way. And that might be the answer there. It's definitely a clue. It's definitely a clue that if you've got stuff working on headphones and not on speakers, it's worth finding out why. I'm going to guess, also, peaks only might help you. Check on peaks only and see if the stuff that you're monitoring, you might have to pad stuff down a little bit if you're working with like commercial mixes. If you pad stuff down identically and then you run peaks only, do the mixes that are working for you balance correctly? And then is the one that's causing problems on the speakers but not headphones, is that blowing up the lows with incredibly loud bass? That might be the secret. I bet you that is the thing. Oh, a usable tape fat be a priority? Probably not. That's based on the iron oxide thing. That's a known thing. Like, I can't change what the algorithm is just based on... You could throw other plugins behind it, maybe. That's the thing is, I'm not sure exactly what you're listening to on or where you're running into this problem, but the iron oxide algorithm is kind of like an average, but it's a scattered average. It's using individual samples that are spaced out according to prime number sequences. So it's returning this scattering of the high frequencies in a way that's not emphasizing any given frequency that much. So what you're asking basically is take tape fat / iron oxide and make it not be tape fat / iron oxide anymore. And I can't do it. I can't do it. So there, when you say usable, basically what you mean is you don't want to use that one. Some of the things that it's doing are producing issues. No comment. I think it's adorable when people think that they control me. I might be making this poor bugger madder. Oh, we'll see. Let me see now. So I can't do anything about tape fat making it be any different, because that's the thing, is I think you're fixating on a part of what the basic algorithm sounds like. I can't actually change that. Yeah, and you pad it, run it into peaks only, or run it into subs only on monitoring. And if you have a lot of lows in the bass and it's okay in headphones, I think the thing that you want to bear in mind is that headphones put out very high peak amplitudes invisibly. You have a way of, like the loud stuff, as long as it's clean, you presumably have good headphones. It sounds like you might have good headphones. The loud stuff is going to come through without making a lot of obvious distortion, much more than, say, on a speaker. And that could very well be the answer there, is you're putting lows that are too low for the speaker to handle. And then that's where you're going to find the solution, is controlling it there. So Kevin, about the monitoring, getting a realistic picture on speakers that don't reproduce subs as well, and I mentioned the small speakers thing. Are you perhaps talking about ORAT? maybe that's what we're talking about, because the oh yeah, Cosmic, you're literally talking about what iron oxide and tape fat do. It's a scattering, it's metallic overtones. That is like prime number distributed sample returns. That's literally what the sound of the plugin does. You can filter afterwards, but nothing will change that part because that's literally what it does. Now let me see. As far as the small speakers and monitoring is concerned, maybe I was talking about ORAT. And that is restricting the bandwidth down so that it's just filtering out lows and highs. So as far as taking the general monitoring and making it work better for use on small speakers, it already does. That's what subs only, etc. do. Also, peaks only will help you with that. Peaks only will identify even completely subsonic bursts of energy that your speakers will never be able to capture. And running peaks only, that'll blow up into loud distortion. So in a very real sense, the way that monitoring already works, it's already designed for all kinds of small speakers or anything else. And there's also the chance of being able to, I just got chance off of Gianluca's Marchese. Maybe I'll get chances off of some of Deshaun's comments, Daddy. There's also a chance, God, now I can't remember what the hell I was saying. Thanks, Deshaun. We're having such fun. You have successfully distracted me to where I don't know what I'm doing. Well done. Should come back again. We'll play this game. But also I'm reminded that Ahmed asked me what next week's plug is. I have no idea. It's probably not going to be Elation because I'm probably going to be doing something else. I have a series of suggestions here that are possibilities. But all I know is I'm going to have something. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to be. Binaural plugin technology, that's the one that people keep asking me about. And the thing about binaural panning is I haven't yet done that plugin. As far as takes on non-emulated gear like 610 Neve Portico or Shelford, what do you mean non-emulated gear? It sounds like just gear. You know, and yeah, mixing wise, I am an LCR guy, so I don't naturally think in terms of making, like, because basically what's going to happen if you're doing binaural panning, I can tell you one thing that happens immediately is that it's going to ruin mono blend, which does relate to cell phone listening for some people, and it's going to produce like flangey artifacts anytime you sum stuff together. If you're listening on a laptop, the laptop is very likely going, or very possibly, not necessarily likely, but possibly, going to have stereo for highs and then a central mid-bass speaker. And your binaural panning is going to screw with that as well. On the whole, it's okay, but it's not the most useful thing in the world. It certainly isn't going to find its way into stuff that I do. Oh, Gianluca, I get what you mean now. What you mean is doing your takes on non-emulated gear such as 610 preamps, Neve Portico, or Shelford, namely somebody else's property that hasn't been stolen by intellectual piracy yet. No, I'm actually not going to be going after stuff that hasn't been copied by plugin makers yet. That's absolutely not going to happen. For a number of years, I've moved away from even using other people's brand names. Back in the day, Channel, and traditionally Channel, has like API Neve and SSL settings, partly because they're just calibrated to be like particular things, but they're not actually a mimicry of that, just a high pass and a slew clipping based on particular behavior. But then, when I started working with the character plugs, rather than naming them after the literal impulse responses I was working with, I came up with a way of generating a new impulse response that was different, and then also naming them other things like precious. Neverland is sketchy because that uses the word Neve in the name, but API Calypse likewise. But I started naming stuff differently so that it didn't literally refer to the things. And then back when I did bus colors is using the same responses as like Neverland or API Calypse. But in bus colors, I literally renamed them to things like Lush and Rock and stuff, just to get another step away from referring to the brand names of the people. So when we talk about things like, are you going to do this Neve Portico mixer and stuff, the trouble of that is literally no, I'm going to completely refuse to do it, because even if I came up with something that got exactly the same sound, I would need to call it something else and probably change it so that it didn't sound exactly the same. Because I'm not okay with sitting on, IP from stuff like that. So there you go. That's a bit of a downer answer, I suppose, but it's the Airwindows thing is no, that's a specific that I can't do, that I won't do. I've been dragging my feet on the Seriously as well, because I did Seriously for Chad Clark, Beauty Pill, and it didn't incorporate some of the stuff that's in the real unit, and I eventually got a real unit. That's what lives on my reverb returns, which is also part of what makes them louder so they can sit in the mix better. But I have not yet done Seriously that does the kind of boosting that the hardware unit seems to do. It seems to do some of the things that I thought it did, but then it also seems to do a massive side channel boost. And it might be like the kind that I have in stereo effects, but the trouble is that on the one hand, like, you can't get these, and when you can, if you're getting like the crate version of it, it's cheap, and it's built into like Winamp or something like that. It does have its uses. Chad really wanted one for using in the box and was sad that I didn't actually master it, didn't actually get it exactly right. But I think part of my resistance there is simply because it's like talking about, I tell you what, we're about done with the chat, so. So I can still see what you guys are saying, but you're not literally in my stream anymore. Sorry, Phobos is chatting a little bit. So one of the things that's inhibiting me as far as Seriously is that I don't actually want to claim that I'm doing a hardware thing that belongs to somebody else. That said, I should do something to do that stuff, because Chad was like, oh, it's doing some of the right things, but there's no question that it's not doing the hyper boost that the real unit did. And now I have one that I'm getting used to and using, so it's probably about time that I dove back into that. After all, I re-released tape because it didn't master the thing that it had going on, so I could probably re-release Seriously simply on the grounds of the guy that asked for this didn't get what he wanted the first time around. And it's probably not working that well for anybody that they would desperately need me to keep the old version. Anyways, I could do the same thing of like leaving it as original version, and then you can pick which one you wanted installed. Anywho, Ian McCarthy says, "Go on, lads, it's 2020. Get the troll out so people who are interested can focus." And there may be a time when I have to start doing that more hardcore. It depends upon whether the trolls are really putting a lot of effort into it. In general, I have just kind of won them over by they find that they're more happy talking about gear and music and stuff, or it's just too boring because people aren't getting mad enough at them, which is sometimes how that works, is people don't get mad enough at them. But yeah, it's 12:49. It's getting time to wind up the stream. I'm going to have a yeah, so Joko Sekovan, you could also try MV, because MV is the bloom effect, so it doesn't build up right away. Or you could do multiple copies of MV after each other, both at their most extreme setting. The noises you make will take forever to start happening. We'll see. Anyways, I think we're winding up, so what I'm going to do is probably, I don't know, go and take a nap. This has been a fairly strenuous stream. I have all the sympathy in the world for hardware controls, although they do want to see themselves up on the video. You'll notice the fellow kind of went away when I wasn't showing his words. Sometimes that's what happens. But it is somewhat more challenging when I got to deal with that. But, you know. Anyways, it's time for me to bid you goodbye for now. I'm going to be doing a couple of music jams. We may or may not have folks from the Streampunks community swinging by. Music jams is more about me doing this stuff and people just listening and looking to the pretty pictures rather than chatting. For now, I will bid you all good night or good day or whatever it is where you're at. And I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.